Orthodox Radio Crusade. Anarchism for the global city. Radical environmentalism for the concrete jungle. Esoteric explorations of the secret history of rebel culture. The Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. Exiled from WBAI 99.5 FM in New York City. Now only on the World Wide Web. Be there.
Welcome aboard to the third internet edition of the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. Hello, all you out there in cyberspace. And we are bringing you this episode today from the hallowed ground of Tompkins Square Park on Manhattan's Lower East Side. And the last time I was speaking to you all from my apartment a few blocks away from here, we were talking about the Arab Spring and how it represented a real historic opening such as the world has not seen since the fall of the Soviet bloc in 1989. And my fears that with the Western intervention in Libya, a thermidor in the Arab revolutions was approaching, and that the window was about to be closed in terms of the possibilities for serious social change. And since then, there's been a development which has given me a great deal of hope that these windows are perhaps beginning to open again, not in the Arab world, but globally. Spreading what began in the Arab world also began in Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin earlier this year, also began in Spain and in Greece. Has come to New York City and to almost every city in America. And this is really, really important, beginning to take back the populist thunder from the right, which has, with the Tea Party movement, has sort of seized it and appropriated it. And ever since Obama's election here in this country, and the protest in Madison, Wisconsin, at the beginning of the year, were the first sign that the progressive forces were beginning to take back the populist initiative and the populist thunder. And now, with the end of the year approaching, a even more significant movement, which is national, perhaps even global in scope, is beginning to emerge. So, as unaccustomed as it is for me to feel optimistic and to cheerlead, here I am doing it. We scored a tremendous victory yesterday, where the police were threatening to clear out the encampment down at Zuccotti Park, or Liberty Plaza, as the protesters have dubbed it, in the financial district, in the name of cleaning it, quote unquote. And what they're actually calling cleaning it was really going to be a de facto eviction. And the protesters came out by the thousands, armed not with sticks and clubs, but with brooms and mops. And they cleaned the park themselves, top to bottom. It was sparkling. I'd never seen such a clean park in New York City. And the police realized that not only were they massively outnumbered, but they had been outmaneuvered on the public relations front, and that they could not get away with this so-called cleaning or eviction of the park. And literally at the last minute, just at 6 o'clock, when they said they were going to come in and do their cleaning or eviction, they backed off and said, "Oh, we changed our minds. We postponed it." So the park remains under occupation. We've got more people out there than I would have thought possible. And at this moment, well, we've got two different demonstrations related to the Occupy Wall Street movement, which are going on at different points around the city. The big one is up at Times Square. That's where I think the masses are massing. But there has also been a call, which has been put out by some of the longtime neighborhood activists here on the Lower East Side, to bring the movement here to Tompkins Square Park. And there's a couple of reasons for this, which have to do with the historical legacy of Tompkins Square Park. First of all, for the Occupy Wall Street movement. Not many people know this, but this movement was not completely spontaneous. It didn't just magically happen at the beginning of September. It had been planned all summer long, and all summer long, when I was hanging out in Tompkins Square Park on the weekends, as I do as a neighborhood resident, people had been meeting in large circles on the ground at the south end of the park, and I was like, "Yo, what's this all about?" And I eventually found out that it was about planning an occupation of Wall Street. So the planning meetings, which took place all summer long for the occupation of Wall Street, actually took place here in Tompkins Square Park. So if in fact the protests, when they're finished at Times Square, they come down here to Tompkins Square, they'll in a certain sense be coming back to their birthplace. And I should also speak a little bit about the more long-term historical legacy of revolutionary struggle around Tompkins Square Park after this musical break. Of course, we hadn't planned any music. So, I've been living in this neighborhood now. Interesting, we were speaking about 1989, the year that the world changed. I moved into the apartment where I now live over on a street not too far from here. Let's just leave it at that. The very week that the Berlin Wall came down in November of 1989. So I've been living here a long time, and I was hanging out in the neighborhood for a lot longer than that. I've been hanging out in this neighborhood since the early 1980s. So it amazes me how much it's changed. And of course, back in the 80s, it was in decay, crime-ridden, dangerous, dirty. Boy, am I ever nostalgic for those days. You know, I really am. Because today it's just been it's been colonized by the yuppies. It's been completely spit-shined. You know, you've got these new ugly, horrifically ugly luxury developments going up all over the place. And, you know, there isn't any authentic culture left. It's being squeezed out at a terrifying pace. And in fact, just as in the sort of cycle of city politics, you know, the hipsters started arriving in the East Village after they got priced out of the West Village, beginning, I guess, in the 1960s. You know, now they've largely been priced out of out of the East Village, and they've jumped the river to Williamsburg. And now I understand they're even being priced out of Williamsburg, and they're moving further east still into Bushwick, which they're now calling East Williamsburg. So just like, they started calling the Lower East Side the East Village. So around it goes. So, I don't mean to glorify crime and dirt and violence, but, if that's the payoff for keeping authentic culture alive, and for and for not having people being displaced from their homes by the rents skyrocketing out of control, I almost think that maybe it's a worthwhile payoff. But anyway, neither here nor there, because what's done is done. You can't turn back the hands of time. Where was I going with all this? Right, how much the neighborhood has changed in the 20 years that I've been living, more than 20 years now that I've been living here. And I'm only going on 30 years that I've been hanging out here. So, not many people remember today, not many of these new neighborhood residents today remember the Tompkins Square riot. And those who do remember the Tompkins Square riot, they think of one night. They think of August 6th, 1988. But the first Tompkins Square riot was not actually in 1988. And it's interesting what happened in the aftermath of 1988. As a result of the riot, and as a part of the whole character of the neighborhood changing, what happened in 1991, after a whole series of riots in the park, beginning in 1988, is the police actually closed the park, and the city came in and renovated it, built a big chicken wire fence around it, and completely renovated the park. And the park was actually closed to the community for about a year, a little bit more than a year, if memory serves. We definitely had one complete summer without a park on the Lower East Side. That would have been the summer of '91, pretty sure. So the park was completely renovated. It was closed for a year, and by the time the park reopened, the entire movement around Tompkins Square Park, which had to do with defending the squats, resisting gentrification, defending the right of the homeless to camp in the park because they had nowhere else to go, that movement was gone by the time the park reopened. The park had been the heart of that movement, and by the time the park reopened, completely renovated, that movement was gone. And there was little standing in the way of the development blitz and gentrification blitz we have seen since then, which has completely changed the face and character of the neighborhood. This is what not many people realize, but this is a cycle which has been underway in the Lower East Side for something like, more than 150 years. The first Tompkins Square Park riot was not in 1988. The first Tompkins Square Park riot was in 1857. That's right, 1857. There is this park was built shortly before then. It was built in the 1820s, I believe, and named after Governor Daniel Tompkins, who was the governor of New York State during the War of 1812, and was responsible for the defense of the state during the war. Who was actually something of a progressive. He later became the vice president of the Republic under James Monroe. Not too crazy about James Monroe, but Daniel Tompkins was actually something of a favorable figure. He was a real advocate of fair dealing for the Native Americans, and an advocate for the poor and relieving them of an undue share of duty in the state militia. And so quite significantly, he signed the legislation which abolished slavery in New York State. Although it did not actually take effect until after his term, nonetheless he signed the law. So, and there were a lot of during this period there were a lot of riots in New York City, which at that time basically what we now think of as Lower Manhattan was New York City. It didn't extend too far above 14th Street. That was kind of the northern border of the city at that time. And there was this dynamic which persists to this day of, the old working class immigrants achieving a little bit of social status and then feeling threatened by the new working class immigrants who were coming in from overseas. And this dynamic initially played out with between the Germans and the Irish. This was originally a German neighborhood, and then most significantly in the 1840s, with the potato famine, lots and lots of Irish folks started coming in. Right at the southeast corner of the park is St. Bridget's Church. Maybe we'll get some footage of that a little bit later too. And the signs were evocative of the building. Which is the so-called famine church, which was built for these refugees from the potato famine from Ireland after 1848. And there were, a whole series of conflicts where, these newer immigrants, poorer immigrants, were sort of, claiming their space and claiming their turf, and the older, in this case, German immigrants feeling threatened. And eventually it became an Irish neighborhood, and the Germans moved uptown to, I guess right around where the Kips Bay area is today. And the first riot was in, once again, it was 1857, where there was a financial crisis that year, and all of the dock workers, the shipbuilders were thrown out of work, just like there's an economic crisis going on right now, and a lot of people have been thrown out of work. At this time, this was actually an industrial neighborhood. They were building ships right along the East River front, where East River Park today is. That was an area they then called Dry Dock, a shipbuilding area where lots of the local Irish folks were employed. And in the economic crisis of that year, 1857, again, a lot of them lost their jobs, and the Dry Dock was closed, people thrown out of work, and a lot of real suffering, hunger, people being cold in the winter. And they held a big demonstration in 1857 here in Tompkins Square Park, and mixed it up with the state militia, or what we now call the National Guard today. And in the immediate aftermath, what do you think happened? The park was closed. The city authorities closed the park for several months, and they renovated it as a way of depriving the movement of a focal point. 1857. So going all the way back to 1857. Let's see. The next time around would have been 1863. Now this was an episode probably a lot of folks are aware of. These were the notorious New York City draft riots, when Tompkins Square was one of several focal points around the city, including Washington Square. Where there was riot and insurrection in response to Abraham Lincoln instating military conscription for the first time in the nation's history, and once again the poor had to bear an undue share of the burden, because at that time, if you were wealthy, you could buy your way out for $300, as later President Grover Cleveland notoriously did. So there was, very good reason for this sort of working class rage against military conscription. Unfortunately, it was due to the politics of the Civil War. It was directed in a very, very, very ugly, reactionary, racist direction, and there was a virtual pogrom against black folks in New York City at that time. And the area, which is now the heart of Greenwich Village, the area immediately south of Washington Square Park, which is today largely colonized by NYU, McDougal Street and Sullivan Street in that area. That was then the black part of town, and it was virtually burned to the ground in these draft riots, which ultimately turned into an anti-black pogrom, very, very ugly. And once again, the National Guard was called out. In fact, National Guard troops were brought in from as far away as Michigan. And there was something like, several days, almost a week of street fighting in New York City at this time. And in the aftermath, when it was finally put down, once again, Tompkins Square Park was shut down. And what began to happen in the aftermath of the draft riots and in the aftermath of the Civil War in the 1870s is that there was a big influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe this time, mostly Jews, Slavs, and Italians, and they brought with them new ideologies: socialism, anarchism, communism, and the working class movement in this neighborhood finally began to be more class conscious, as opposed to their class resentments being siphoned off into racism and ethnic politics. And there were figures like our hero on the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade, Emma Goldman, the famous anarchist of her day, who actually lived in this neighborhood over on, I believe it was 13th Street. And so by the time, this is actually a little bit before Emma Goldman's time, but already, anarchism had a foothold in the neighborhood by the time of the next big Tompkins Square riot, which was 1874, 2 years after the Paris Commune, when once again there was a tremendous economic crash, and people all over the city were thrown out of work, and there was terrible suffering. And in the winter of that year, as a matter of fact, it was a very, very harsh winter. People didn't have enough to eat, and people were really, really suffering. And I believe it was in January of 1874, a big citywide meeting of the unemployed was held here in Tompkins Square Park, and was viciously attacked by the police, who they sort of pulled a bait and switch. This was sort of what we were afraid was going to happen yesterday morning at Zucchione Park down in the financial district, but thank goodness it didn't happen. The police denied a permit for the march after first saying it could go ahead. They then at the last minute denied a permit for the gathering. And this was, of course, there wasn't even any radio back then, much less the internet. So nobody knew. There was no time to get the word out that the meeting had been called out. So thousands of people showed up here in Tompkins Square Park, and the police charged in on horseback with their clubs flailing. And it was a real melee. And as some of the newspaper accounts, which I've seen from the time, put it, the snow was stained with blood. And interestingly, one of the figures, not a particularly radical figure, in fact, he was sort of alienated by the radicalism which he saw as leading to the violence that day, was Samuel Gompers, the founder of the AFL, who had to jump down into a basement to escape a police charge. So, and again, in the immediate aftermath of 1874, the park was closed by the city authorities and completely razed. Every tree in the park was cut down. The fountains and the benches and everything completely razed. The park was reduced to rubble by the city authorities in the aftermath of the riot of 1874. And eventually, people were allowed back in, but it wasn't really a park. It had turned into a drill ground for the state militia. And the next big demonstration here was in 1877. History buffs will recall that was the year of the National Railroad strike, and part of the struggle for the 8-hour day, which was ultimately a successful struggle. And there were labor mobilizations across the country. and the one here in New York City that year, 1877, took place here in Tompkins Square Park. But it wasn't really a park at that time. It was a drill ground for the state militia. Empty, an empty field without even any grass, just essentially dirt and rubble and dust. But a movement began to emerge for reopening the park, and Frederick Law Olmsted, the famous visionary who designed Central Park and Prospect Park out in Brooklyn, was called in to redesign Tompkins Square Park as a result of pressure from the community and a whole long mobilization by the community to demand that they have a park once again, and that this drill ground for the state militia be once again turned back into a park. And ultimately, this drive was successful, and in fact, it was. And this was during the period of Tammany Hall and corrupt machine politics at its very, very worst in New York City. The money for Olmsted's very ambitious and visionary plans for the park mysteriously, or not so mysteriously, disappeared, and ultimately his plan was significantly modified. Unfortunately, he had designed apparently his real sort of fairy tale vision of what the park could look like, with all these little groves and nooks and crannies. Well, that ultimately didn't quite come into fruition. I believe elements of his plan were incorporated into the final design, but largely it was greatly modified. So, but finally, the park was reopened. I believe, probably into the 1880s. By this point, the park was reopened again, and it was a park once again. And Tompkins Square once again was a park, and the Lower East Side had a park, and it was a victory for the people. And for the next century, things began to change a lot in the 20th century in this neighborhood. Needless to say, that last wave of immigration, the Eastern Europeans. That door was shut with the anti-immigrant legislation of the 1820s, but a new wave of immigrants started coming in largely from Puerto Rico, beginning in the 1950s, and then from elsewhere in Latin America, and some African American folk coming into the neighborhood as well. So the neighborhood was a real ethnic mix by the time of the 1960s, and there was once again this same dynamic of some of the older immigrants, some of the older, more established immigrants who had been, when they first arrived a generation or two ago, they had been living in desperate poverty themselves, but now they had established a certain degree of Social Security, and they felt threatened by the new wave of immigrants coming in, just as the Germans had felt threatened by the Irish, and then the Irish had felt threatened by the Jews and the Slavs and the Italians. Now the Jews and the Slavs and the Italians felt threatened by the Puerto Ricans and the Dominicans and the African Americans. So once again, there was a certain sense of tension which was emerging in the neighborhood in the 1960s. And I believe it was in 1967 the Tompkins Square bandshell was built, particularly as a means of cultural exchange, where every ethnic group in the neighborhood could have a forum for their music and their culture to be represented here. We would all get to know each other and learn how to get along. That was the idea behind it. And I understand that one of the first acts to actually play at the Tompkins Square bandshell was the Grateful Dead in one of their first appearances on the East Coast when they were visiting from California back in 1967. So a real little bit of history here. And it was also that same year 1967 that the next Tompkins Square Park riot happened. And apparently there were a bunch of I should say, by the way, that the next big wave of immigrants to come in, so to speak, weren't really immigrants. They weren't coming from overseas. They were refugees from suburban Middle America who were looking for the scene. And this was, of course, the hipsters and the runaways. And just like there was this big sort of youth scene happening in the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco at this time, in the Summer of Love and all of that, there was a similar scene which was not quite so hyped by the media. It was more of an underground scene happening here on the Lower East Side, which for the first time began to be known as the East Village at this time. So, and you had bands like the Fugs, and you had groups like the Diggers and the Yippies and the Provos and the Up Against the Wall Mother. Can I say that word? Let's say the Up Against the Wall Mother Freakers were beginning to emerge. All these sort of white radical new left kind of counterculture oriented groups. So apparently on Memorial Day of 1967, there were a bunch of hippies strumming on guitars and Puerto Ricans beating on bongo drums, having a good old time in the park. And some of the neighbors started to complain about the noise and called in the police. And the police were met with locked arms, and they responded by swinging their clubs. And there was a big melee, the 1967 Tompkins Square riot. So the first one since 1877. So the neighborhood actually went for, 90 years? Went for 90 years without a riot. A record in its history, as we shall see. So fast forwarding a little bit to bring it up to the cataclysm of 1988. Well, notoriously, of course, there was this, in the immediate aftermath of the cultural explosion of the late 1960s, there was this whole notorious process of urban blight, to use the cliche, and the neighborhood very, very rapidly declined, and the so-called people drugs like marijuana and LSD began to be displaced by the death drugs like heroin and cocaine. And there was landlord arson as buildings were declining, and people were being pushed out by crime and violence and so on. Landlords felt that it was easier to burn their own buildings down and collect on the insurance, and this led to the virtual destruction, notoriously, of the South Bronx in the same era. And those same flames of landlord arson were beginning to flicker on the Lower East Side as well at this time. And this, by the time I started hanging out in this neighborhood in the early 1980s, particularly the Alphabet City area was really kind of a scary ghost town with a lot of burnt out buildings and heroin dealing going on quite openly on the street. And it was also during this period the first seeds of resistance started to emerge, where people started reclaiming empty, abandoned tenements, which had been taken over by the city and just kind of left to rot, and the squatter movement began to emerge. And finally, in the beginnings of gentrification under Mayor Koch in the 1980s, when the whole in the same sort of cycle once again, this area becoming a haven for artists, and then becoming a little bit becoming chic once again, and then the struggling radical chic artists giving way to the more established bourgeois chic artists, and then the artists entirely giving way to there aren't any artists hardly at all left on the Lower East Side now. Then the artists entirely giving way to the uppies, and now we've got goddamn Kmart on the Lower East Side and Whole Foods. But that's getting ahead of the story a little bit. The beginnings of gentrification starting to happen in this period back in the 1980s, and at the same time, people being displaced, rents going up, people being displaced from their homes. The homeless set up an encampment in Tompkins Square Park, and the city made certain moves to evict them, and there was talk for the first time of imposing a curfew in the park. And they were going to kick everybody out of the park at 1 o'clock in the morning, And certain people in the neighborhood decided that the squatters and others, their supporters, I was living in Brooklyn at the time, but I came in that night from Flatbush, where I was living, to support the people in the park who were going to refuse to be evicted on the night of August 6, 1988. And as we all know, it turned into a huge police riot, is what we call it, because the police really just savagely attacked not only protesters but everybody who was on Avenue A that night, and a lot of people were sent to the hospital. And this was the beginning of a whole series of, in the aftermath, I should say, in the immediate aftermath, there was such an outcry about the police, the horrific police brutality that night, that the city was forced to back off and to rescind the curfew. And then Tompkins Square Park became the only park in the city that had no curfew. So it was a clear-cut victory. And for the remaining 3 years after that, before the big backlash came, there was a really strong movement in the neighborhood. And every time, the police made any kind of moves to try to evict the homeless encampment, which had been established in the park, or to evict any of the squats in the neighborhood, there were big mobilizations. So there were a whole series actually of riots and clashes around Tompkins Square Park for the next 3 years, until finally it would have been, I believe, the Memorial Day 1991 final riot, in which a really, really bad move, possibly carried out by police provocateurs, a convenience store was ransacked. Not even, any of the more yuppie-oriented, boutiques and whatnot, which had started to open on Avenue A at that point, but just an unassuming convenience store run by Pakistani immigrant folks was ransacked. Really, really bad move, and this was sort of used as the excuse to once again shut down the park and completely renovate it, which brings us back to where we began. Here we are. So we're going to find out tonight, because there's been a call which has been put out by certain of the neighborhood activists to bring the Occupy Wall Street encampment up here to Tompkins Square Park. And I should say that just to kind of stick it to us, not only did they when the park reopened in 1990, let's see, when did it reopen? They closed it in 1991. I guess it reopened in 92, if memory serves. Just to stick it to us, that not only did they reimpose the curfew, of course, but not only is it a 1 a.m. curfew, it's a midnight curfew. So it's actually an hour earlier than the curfew they tried to impose back in 1988. So we're going to find out tonight if, in fact, a bunch of people from the Occupy Wall Street encampment are going to come up here to Tompkins Square Park, or perhaps down here to Tompkins Square Park, because there's a big, the occupation folks are having a big rally up at Times Square at the moment. It's very curious to know how that's going. But I understand some of them are going to come down from Times Square here to Tompkins Square when that's over, which should be very soon, in fact. And we're going to see if people are, in fact, going to camp out in Tompkins Square Park tonight, and if Occupy Wall Street is going to come home to Tompkins Square Park, and if, in fact, the police are going to try to enforce the curfew, and what's going to happen, and whether or not, for the first time since 1991, there is going to be a curfew-free night in which the people take back Tompkins Square Park. So stay tuned. By the time this is up on the web, we'll know what had happened tonight. So watch my website, WorldWar4Report.com, www.Arabic4Report.com, and read all about it. And, see you on the front lines, folks. Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, Where are you? Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Maybe I'll see you there. Thanks. Bye. Washington Square. Let's go to Washington Square. You guys want to do that?
Absolutely.
Let's go. And we got word that the action is still happening up at Times Square, and there's some people that come down here to Washington Square. So here we are at Washington Square, and we're going to see what's going on.
Yeah, it is.
I thought they were like for it.
Oh, for it.
I was
Yeah.
Okay. I was just going on my own back in early August. And a couple months
September 17th was the initial demonstration on Wall Street. And then it was the day that we walked up to Liberty Plaza and people set up camp there. Oh, yeah. So that was terrific. And they've managed to maintain themselves there for a month now. And pretty good. Pretty good. Very inspiring thing. Very good. More successful than I ever imagined. It's a permanent public assembly. And you have to have that. You've had these problems that have been created 50 years of all this nonsense destroying America. You can't solve it in 1 or 2 weeks. You've got to have a permanent public assembly in order to, and also one of the things that they have called for is the diversification of the public assembly into major New York neighborhoods. Like right now they're going to have a teach-in about Occupy the Bronx, where you're going to be able to deal with, you have a group in the Bronx and a group in the Lower East Side, one in Brooklyn. Very good. And that's essential to an organization, is to have different, parts and different neighborhoods, discuss the issues in the neighborhood. That's all. So it's great, as long as this doesn't become only a permanent demonstration, because that would be only good for publicity purposes, right? But in order to deal with the Democrats and Republicans, you need to organize in the neighborhood. Get rid of Democrats and Republicans. It's a two-headed tyranny. Mubarak was one guy. This is Democrats and Republicans, right? But behind Mubarak was the Egyptian military and the oligarchy. And behind the Democrats and Republicans, when you remove them, then you'll see the oligarchy and the military, and then you have to deal with that. Right, but just to play devil's advocate here, removing the Democrats and Republicans is much easier said than done. And the reason is that, the reason that the Democrats feel that they can take our votes for granted because we're all so scared of the Republicans and our bad things will be unto them, of course, is that there's some truth to it. Yeah, of course there's truth to it. Of course there's truth to it. All those arguments, right? You're electing Bush. You're taking a vote away from Gore, right? How many times have you heard that? Well, let me tell you, I voted for Nader in that election, and I regretted it. I live to regret it. Excellent. Any reasonable person, excellent. Any reasonable person would regret putting Bush in there. Preference order voting. That wasn't just it, by the way. What was the other regret? The other regret is that Nader turned out to have really bad politics, really bad, stupid, wacky politics, which I didn't realize at the time. Well, that may be true in some. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, the fact that he's in bed with Pat Buchanan, and this whole stupid flirtation with the xenophobe right, which I will not forgive him for. Okay, before we discuss that, let me just put this on the table around here. How are you going to get preference order voting? Okay, it's much more descriptive. Just like the Tobin tax. You ever call it the Tobin tax? It's a sales tax on Wall Street. Okay, sales tax on Wall Street transactions. Preference order voting. You can go 1, 2, 3. You can write Nader 1, back it up with 4. Let's put that on the ballot in New York State and put it in there. Everybody loves that idea. It can be voted in. Well, again, to play devil's advocate, that's what we did at the so-called democratization process at Pacifica, and it turned into a total debacle. Okay. Well, but I mean, what's the debacle though? Is that system of voting a debacle, or is there some other kind of debacle? That's a legitimate question. I'm merely pointing out that it's been a debacle. Yeah. Or things can always be a debacle. Right now, what you've got is a frozen political system that's absolutely incapable of changing.
Photographer had his camera lens broken. Boy, he pissed. He was like, I'm going to tell him what happened. But I think the cops just didn't expect so many thousands of people to show up and surround them. So that got them nervous.
And there's still folks up there.
Well, they weren't allowed to leave, but...
They weren't allowed to leave?
Yeah, I heard the cops, tell them to leave 46, we're going to, whatever. But, so, I think people are trickling away, though. They got tired of just being penned in like cattle.
Well, they're not letting people leave. But they're just letting them leave in a trickle so as to break up the group. Is that the idea?
Not even. People kind of broke out and started to trickle away. But this whole crowd control thing, and then they did bust out the orange nets. It's just...
almost tempted to go up there.
Well, I think it's probably tapering off now, but it's ridiculous. What a waste of city resources at the time the city's completely broke, But anyway, what was interesting was to see the ticker tape on Times Square going, Occupy Wall Street, movement goes worldwide, and right underneath this is massive protest. That was kind of cool.
Yeah,
see that
every
every day.
A great shot.
Yeah. A handy anti-police brutality device.
Folks, I should say that in the last episode, of course, I said that I was hopefully going to be going to North Africa this fall. And as it turned out, I didn't. I'm here in New York. I'm not in North Africa. And, I was going to go to North Africa chasing after, the opportunity to witness revolution in some foreign land. And instead, I seem to be witnessing it here in my own city. So I'm really glad, in fact, that I'm here in New York to witness history being made in my hometown. I'd just like to say that, I did make a fund appeal to send me to North Africa, and I would like to say to the two of you who responded very generously, only two of you, but very generously, that money will go towards keeping my journalistic efforts alive for the next year, and I do hope to make it to North Africa next fall. So your donations will go towards that. And meanwhile, once again, stay tuned to what's happening here in New York City through the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade and World War IV Report and the other available alternative media. Thank you.